All right, so this is the video for chapter 4, which is introducing quantitative designs. And so before I get into the chapter material, a little bit of reminder about past material we've gone over. So, we introduced this research model early on in the course. I want to say it was probably like one of the first videos. And at this point, we have discussed the first 4 steps, selecting a topic, defining the problem. Also, you can kind of think of that as, constructing your question, reviewing the literature, and formulating a testable hypothesis. Really, all 4 of those steps were covered in chapters 2 and 3 from the last module. So now we're getting into this step 5 where you're choosing a research method. And obviously, just because of, the nature of this class, Introduction to Research Methods, this is a step that, we're going to spend a lot of time on. And let me just clarify something that's come up when talking to other students. You are not actually going to be collecting data. You are not really going to be learning how to analyze data except in very broad general terms. You will be doing that in other classes, and that's why this class is a prerequisite for those other classes, so you can kind of understand the logic and theory behind a lot of these concepts and methods before you go on to take a whole course on it. So, we have now reached the step that we will be spending almost the rest of the semester on, just going over it in very meticulous detail. So before we get into that chapter material, just another reminder of past terms that you've learned that are relevant here. A reminder that in sociology, we conduct both deductive research and inductive research. With deductive research, oftentimes, this is research that is based on other known research. And so this is the type of research that closely follows that 8-step research model, where after you define your question, you go out and you look at the literature, and then based on that literature, you formulate a hypothesis. So there is a hypothesis in deductive research. And although not always, but this type of research is more closely aligned with quantitative methodology. Inductive research is you gather data and then you kind of develop your ideas. And so this is sometimes because this is like a new stream of research or a new population or under-researched topic, but you don't actually do you don't really turn to what's already known before you go out in the field and collect your data. So there is no hypothesis in this form of research. And although it doesn't have to be qualitative methodology, oftentimes it is. And because there's no hypothesis, as we discussed in chapter 2, this type of research oftentimes asks open-ended questions. So, although with the quantitative design, it can be deductive or inductive, oftentimes these types of methods are associated with deductive research. And this is the final of the reminder slides, because we have talked about quantitative and qualitative research before. Quantitative research is gathering data that can be quantified, that can be turned into numbers, that we then analyze using computer programs and statistical analyses. This type of research is especially helpful for providing insight into patterns of social behavior and social attitudes, because it allows you to conduct large-scale surveys and have potentially large sample sizes. While qualitative research collects textual data that cannot be quantified. And although we do use computer programs in order to code to code that data, we do not run statistical analyses on qualitative data. So this type of research provides in-depth knowledge of social life, processes, institutions, as opposed to those large-scale sample surveys with large sample sizes. usually you have much smaller sample sizes, and you are using methods like focus groups, participant, non-participant observations, unstructured or semi-structured interviews, would all be good examples of how we collect qualitative research. So, just remember, a good way to think about this is, when you want large sample sizes, but perhaps more superficial data, quantitative research is great for those types of research needs, versus when you want really detailed, in-depth data, but perhaps can only get it from a much smaller sample. Then qualitative research methodologies are best for those needs. So let's now kind of turn to our chapter. So the chapter begins off by, talking about, designing a research study. And, they compare it to the analogy of designing, an empty room, right? That you need to kind of approach it from like this methodical, like logical kind of mindset, where you begin with, one element of design. And once you decide upon that, you can then decide upon another element of design, and so on and so forth. And so, the kind of order that they suggest that you begin is, first of all, kind of conceptualize the purpose of your study, and then consider some basic details related to participants, how to locate them, recruit them for participation, and, what is your communication going to look like with them. And then finally, to really begin to visualize the study and determine some of its practical, details like, budget, and personnel, and what other types of things do you need practically, in order to bring the study to fruition. So that's kind of what this chapter goes over, to some degree, is, providing you some of this basic knowledge and terminology, so that you can kind of address these questions for your proposal, for your proposed study. So let's begin first with that step one, purpose. And the first characteristic of research design involves what are we trying to accomplish in the study? There are kind of three broad types of studies that you can do. And part of what you have to determine is kind of, what is your goal, what is your purpose, what is your objective. If you want to explore a new relationship between variables, then that's an exploratory study. If you want to describe some phenomena in great detail, a descriptive study. And if you want to explain an established relationship between variables, that's an explanatory study. So let's look at each of those in a little bit more detail, beginning with exploratory. This is the type of study that answers the question of what. And as your book notes, these types of studies investigate new topics of research, or a new thread of established relationships, or it tests a new methodology or new instrument of data collection, or sometimes it's just meant to gain a deeper understanding of a population. And so, the kind of reoccurring theme here is the word new. And so for these types of studies, this your book doesn't emphasize this, but exploratory studies are more likely to be inductive than deductive, because usually there is not necessarily a lot of literature that you can turn to, especially if it truly is a new topic, or gaining a deeper understanding of an understudied population. They note that these types of studies can be initiators for larger, more complex studies. And that's another kind of hint that this type of study is more likely to be inductive with qualitative methodology than deductive with quantitative methodology. That you're using a smaller sample size in order to answer that question, what, to figure out what's going on. And they said, in order to decide if your research is exploratory, consult the literature, right? If you're asking a question that largely has been asked before, and you aren't really making any type of new developments in terms of methods or instrument of data collection, or you're not posing some new relationship between variables, then it's probably not an exploratory study. So another type of study that also is more likely to be qualitative are descriptive studies. And so this case, it's not so much that it's new, but the focus is really on, you really just want a high level of detail. And so for this type of study, you're answering the question how, and it's generally qualitative because you're wanting to really figure something out about a phenomena or a population or understanding people's experiences. And in order to address that question, you're probably going to be asking open-ended questions with maybe just, semi-structured interview, allowing people the opportunity and the space to really explain to you their perception of what is going on. And so the focus is, as they say, on describing a phenomenon or understanding the details about a people's experience. And the idea, because sometimes it's like, because these types of descriptive studies, particularly case studies, which are very small in sample size, or you're only focusing on, a handful of cases, sometimes people are like, okay, well, what is the larger purpose of this? Like, besides just being interesting, I mean, what's the point of this? If it can't be generalized to, much more than the people that you collect the data from. And the idea is that sometimes by obtaining an increased understanding, this is what allows us to do things like to design interventions and policies meant to assist. Sometimes if we don't understand what's going on, if we really don't know, how something is impacting a person's life, or, how people perceive things, or, what might be going on, then this might lead us to miss out on an opportunity to provide assistance, or this might lead us to make policies that we think are helpful but are really not. So, descriptive studies do serve a real purpose, even if the data that we are collecting comes from a very limited, small number of people. And then the final type of broad category of study is explanatory. And this answers the questions why, or answers the question why. And your book also refers to this type of study as a reinforcing study. And really, just by that name, reinforcing, that is a hint that you are exploring and explaining the reasons behind an already known or an established phenomenon or relationship. So you're not covering any new ground. Now, your book notes that this can be quantitative or qualitative. But particularly, unlike like the descriptive study, which really is almost never quantitative, explanatory studies, as we will discuss later in this chapter, if you are wanting to explain a causal relationship in particular, this is especially helpful if you approach this from a quantitative design. And we'll talk more about causality here in a second. So, you make that decision early on. You have a topic, you have a question, and you really think like, is my question, like, is how I'm framing this question, is this meant to be explanatory, descriptive, or exploratory? And so that's one of the first few things you decide. The next thing you decide is related to your participants and collecting data from them. So this chapter doesn't talk about sampling. So that's going to be coming up in a later chapter. But, just remember from chapter 2, when we were talking about constructing your question, that your question is significant to a particular population, right? It is pertinent to a population, right? So, depending on the type of question you're asking, it might be pertinent to like all adults, all adults in the US, or it might be a question that's pertinent more to children, or a question that's pertinent to women, or a question that's pertinent to women in STEM occupations, right? So you need to look at your question and kind of note like who is the population that my question is referring to. And then, like I said, in upcoming chapters, we'll talk about then how do I gather a sample of people from that population in order to collect data from to address my question. But for this chapter, the focus is on like how frequently are you going to be collecting data from those people? And there's kind of two ways of thinking about this. There is like you can collect the data once, and we call that type of data and data collection cross-sectional. As your book notes, it's a simple snapshot of data collected one point in time, and there is no follow-up data collection with these participants. Now, you can collect similar data from different groups of people, multiple times, over a time period. But because you're collecting them from different people that have no real relationship with one another, like they're not in the same cohort, they're not the same type of people even, all of that would still be each time you collected that data, it would be called cross-sectional data. So, there are some, in your book notes, this is a very popular form of data collection. And part of the reason why it's so popular is because it is relatively quick, because it's just one-shot data collection. It's inexpensive, and the spread, because it's just, one shot, you don't have to worry about collecting, tracking people down over time and collecting data from them over a long time period. Like oftentimes that means that you can ask them a lot of questions, on your instrument at that one time. And so your book refers to this as spread. Oftentimes, this type of data collection has a large spread. They ask about a lot of questions. A good example, of cross-sectional data that's been collected at multiple time points is the General Social Survey. This is a survey that it asks about a wide range of topics. And so it's a good example of what's meant by that concept of spread. Now, there are some disadvantages, some pretty significant disadvantages to cross-sectional data collection, even with these advantages that need to be addressed. And so first of all is because you're only collecting data at that one single shot, you run into issues being able to make any arguments in regards to causality. And we'll talk about that in some upcoming slides. And then there are no repeats. And so, that really, opens you up to if there are any errors in data collection, any systematic errors that could possibly lead to some biases, you're not going to be able to address them because you aren't repeating your data collection. So you got to work with what you got, from that single shot of that single shot. And that can be problematic. And certainly one reason why it can be problematic is because you're only asking these people these questions one time. Your study can be vulnerable to disturbing variables in participants, right? They could be in a bad mood. They cannot take it seriously. They cannot understand something and skip a bunch of questions. And like I said, once again, because you aren't repeating it, you're kind of stuck with the data that you collect from them, and that it could have been biased in ways that you were unaware of. And that would be a hard error to catch. The alternative to cross-sectional data collection is longitudinal data collection, longitudinal studies. And this is data that's collected at different points in time. So it's collected over time. The first data collection is called the base wave, and then every data collection point after that is enumerated. So wave 2, wave 3. So there isn't a wave 1 because, there is a wave 1, but the correct terminology for that is base wave. And then every wave that comes after that is categorized by a number. There are different types of longitudinal studies, and we'll talk about that in the in the next couple of slides. But just in general, for all longitudinal studies, in terms of advantages, is seen as much more accurate than cross-sectional data collection because, it does have those repeats, and therefore it is a little bit less vulnerable to those disturbing variables that we discussed. And especially if you are wanting to do an explanatory study that is asserting causality, longitudinal data allows you to establish causality much more strongly and with much more confidence than what cross-sectional data can. The disadvantages is that, it's because it's over time, that means it also requires a lot of time. It's costly, and, it's costly in terms of, just participant retention, incentivizing, tracking people down, keeping personnel for a prolonged period of time on your study. All of that is just additional costs that you don't see with cross-sectional data collection. And then, as I mentioned, participant retention is an issue if you are doing like a panel study. We'll talk about that more on the next slide. So there are 3 types of longitudinal studies you need to know. I just referenced panel studies. These are longitudinal studies that follow and accumulate data from the same participants over time. So, and this group of participants is called a panel. So let's say I was doing a study of the long-term effects of the social relationships students develop in college. And my panel during my base wave are 100 incoming freshmen at 5 of the CSU campuses. So those are my panel. And I collect data from them their freshman year, base wave. I collect data from them their senior year, wave 2. I collect data from them at their 5-year reunion, that's wave 3, and then I collect data from them at their 10-year reunion, that's wave 4. So it's a 10-year study, or really 14-year study. So let's think about that. The advantages of that type of study is, it's going to allow me to make some arguments about causality because I will be able to determine time order with variables because I would have been collecting the data over time. I can say with confidence, oh yes, this experience caused this in these in these participants. And I would know for a fact, or I would be able to strongly claim that for a fact because I would have the data that would be able to show the difference in the dependent variable before and after the introduction of the independent variable. All of that's a lot of convoluted mess to say. That's just not possible when in a cross-sectional data collection where you're only talking to a person once, and you can't necessarily be confident with all variables, what came first, the chicken or the egg, because you're only collecting data from them at that one time point. So panel studies are great for establishing causality. They're also therefore much more accurate. And you have that minimization of error, because you are going to be gathering data from them at repeated time periods. It's highly unlikely that you will have to worry about an ongoing trend of the same disturbance variables popping up in your participants at every wave of data collection. Now, disadvantages, it is costly. Like I said, for 14 years, I'll be having to, have personnel working on this study. It's limited in size. You can't have a super huge sample with this type of study just because, once again, it's going to be really costly to keep track of those participants, to provide incentives for them to continue to talk to you and provide data over 14 years of their life. It will be a lot easier if you just make your sample size a little smaller than what cross-sectional data collection, what they can collect. And then, of course, with every single wave, you have to worry about sample size attrition, and that's when you lose people. Like either you can't find them or you find them and they no longer want to participate. And we talk about that loss of participants. We refer to that as attrition. And obviously, attrition doesn't even exist in cross-sectional, data collection because you're only talking to them once. Then we have trend studies. So for this type of longitudinal study, you do collect data at different points in time, but you collect it from different participants of the same population. And so the focus is on capturing trends of a specific population. So let me stick to my example about like the social relationship of college students. So instead of following that panel across 14 years and 4 waves of data collection, instead what I can do is I can say, okay, I'm going to talk to a sample of seniors at CSU. Every 4 years, I'm going to talk to a sample of CSU seniors. So obviously, although my population will stay the same, it's CSU campus seniors, the participants themselves will change because every 4 years, I mean, hopefully nobody is repeating their senior year for 4+ years. So, the actual people will change, but the population stays the same. So I would be making conclusions not about those people, but about the population, any trends I might notice over time. And so your book notes that this is a very useful type of way of setting up your study if you want to do a comparison study, and that's whether you want to compare across cultures or, in my fake suggestion, compare over time. And the final type of longitudinal study that your book goes over is a cohort study. And so this is a longitudinal study that follows the same cohort of people over time. So it is kind of in some ways like it's not the same as a panel study because it's not the same people over time, but it's different people from the same cohort. So let's say that, I'm studying Gen Z and their reactions to public affairs. And so, the Gen Z cohort has a, specific birth year. And so, let me I want to be very, very precise. So the birth year is mid to late 1990s up until the early 2010s. So that's my cohort. So I'm not talking to the same people, but like every 4 years, 5 years, let's say I talk to a different group of people who are part of Gen Z, meaning they were born during that time period. So it's very similar, and it's more similar to the trend study than to the panel study. But it is introducing this concept of cohort, which is a unique subpopulation, right? So it's not as broad as the trend study where you're just talking to different participants of the same population. But with the cohort study, you are going to be getting data from that same cohort of people over time. There is a study that does this with the group of people like that, my parents are part of. My parents, their high schools desegregated their senior year of high school. And so, although different schools in the South desegregated at different time periods, it was in most states about a time period of 7 to 10 years. And so, there are studies that look at kind of the long-term effects and responses of these largely white and Black students who experience school desegregation during their high school years. And so my parents are part of that cohort, right? So they wouldn't necessarily talk to the same people each time, but they would talk to people who graduated from these desegregated high schools during that specific time period. And so those are the 3 types of longitudinal studies. So, at this point, we've determined our purpose. We've determined now, am I going to collect cross-sectional, data, or I'm going to collect longitudinal data? And if I'm going to collect longitudinal data, am I going to do so using a panel, a trend, or a cohort study? And all of this is just trying to figure out what makes the most sense for our question. The next thing is related to causality. Right, forgive me. I had to pause there for a second. I was about to sneeze all in the video. So we're going to talk about causality. And so, for this, your book was discussing, you have two options, kind of depending on what are you trying to say about the causal relationship between your variables. If you are, or if you're wanting to do what is called nomothetic research, that's research that aims to establish causal relationships that can be applied to the population at large. In order to establish causal relationships, your book notes, first of all, most of the time this is quantitative data. It's usually deductive research. And because of when we go over these three criteria, you'll see that, because of the time order criteria, it's also best if it's longitudinal. You have a stronger claim at time order. It doesn't always have to be longitudinal. Sometimes some things are clearly before or after, or before the dependent variable, and you can collect that information even cross-sectionally. But certainly, longitudinal data collection is normally able to establish causality much better than cross-sectional data. So let's just kind of consider this nomothetic causality and the three criteria. So the first criteria is correlation. This is pretty straightforward, and this is what cross-sectional data can easily establish, even just being single shot data collection, because all correlation is that the variables that we are studying are related to one another, that the changes in the independent variable go in hand with the changes in the dependent variable. And so I pulled up that graphic that I put on a previous lecture when I was talking about IV/DVs, right? And you'll see that, in this graphic, it says the IV influences change in the DV. And it doesn't necessarily say cause. And that's because, if your study doesn't meet the three criteria, you really should not be using terminology suggesting causality, because you don't meet the requirement to do so. But you can say, my IV, seems to be correlated with the DV in this direction. And so, if you've ever heard someone say, in response to something, correlation is not causation, or causation is not correlation, or no, usually it's definitely the other way. Correlation is not causation. That's what they're getting at. Things can happen together without something being the cause of that other thing. But in order to establish causality, the very first criteria you need to meet is you need to show that your your independent variable and dependent variable do seem to have a relationship with one another. The second thing that you need to show, which I've already kind of discussed, is time order. And so with time order, you need to show that the actual order of changes from one variable to the other, that the dependent variable changes after the independent variable, so that the independent variable has to occur first in time, and then the changes in the dependent variable has to occur after that fact. And your book notes that, it's hard to even really think so much about this in terms of applying it to our day-to-day life, because, we know the causes of so much of what we do. I know that I'm trying to think, your book uses, I think, the laundry example.
I know that if how much food I have in the house causes causes my decision to buy out or not buy out. If I was studying this in other people, then I might would question, like, is that the only cause? But in my own life, I know how much food I have. That the extent to which I bought groceries precedes my decision later that night about whether or not I'm going to buy dinner out or make dinner at home. Like you don't have to overthink it. But when you are collecting data, you do have to make sure that you can establish causality. And because you aren't in the heads and you aren't like a fly on the wall in the lives of your participants, it's a little bit more complicated than how we might think of it when we're trying to just pull examples from our own day-to-day lives. And then the final one is non-spuriousness. And so if you can recall, I'm sure some of you don't want to recall, intervening and extraneous variables, those other variables outside of the independent variable and the dependent variable that can influence either the independent variable, the dependent variable, the relationship between the two. What you don't want is for one of these other variables to really be what is influencing the relationship between your IV and DV, because then what you think of as being the relationship between the IV and DV is actually spurious, right? Spurious relationship is a false one. So, think back to the multiple examples that we gave about like summertime in chapter 2, right? So it's not that ice cream sales, when, people buying more ice cream causes people to have more sunburns, right? It really is that intervening variable of hot temperatures, hot weather, that is influencing both ice cream consumption and sunburns. So the relationship between ice cream consumption and sunburns is actually a spurious one. It's a false one. And so you want to avoid spuriousness if you're going to talk about causality. And so for that reason, um, you know, um, uh, not as many researchers in sociology use causality, use that type of terminology as you would think. Now, another type of research that sociologists do is idiographic. And this is an attempt to explain the entire realm of influence, all possible causes that influenced a phenomenon or an event for an individual, because you're trying to influence all the things that could have made a person who they are or impacted their behavior or their decision. Obviously this is qualitative in nature, because of the level of detail that you would need to get from your data in order to cover this. And oftentimes, because of the level of detail you needed, it's not just qualitative in nature, but it's the type of qualitative methodology that is reliant on very small sample sizes. So once again, something like case studies or unstructured interviews. This type of research is very time consuming. Um, and it is enlightening. It tends to be more exploratory in nature. And what you learn can then fuel later nomothetic research. Once you're more confident about the things that might be influencing people based on your small sample, then you might be able to then turn this into a study where you try to determine causality and be able to generalize it to a larger population by collecting quantitative data from a much larger sample. And I give you a little graphic there that I think is helpful. Just kind of remember that nomothetic focuses on attempts to generalize to people. It attempts to establish causality. It's based on quantitative data, for the most part. While idiographic is focused on like the subjective experiences, the unique experiences of usually a small number of people. So it's qualitative in form. And so, this is when I teach the methods chapter, when I teach intro, you know, depending on the textbook I'm using, uh, the textbook normally highlights either 5 to 7, primary research designs that we use to collect data in sociology. The last textbook I used highlighted 7 of those. Some of which we will talk about more than others in this class. One of which we're going to talk a lot about for the remainder of this chapter, and that's experimentation. But just kind of the 7 broad types, surveys, and surveys can take the form of questionnaires, interviews, or focus groups. Surveys can be quantitative or qualitative methodology, kind of depending on your instrument and the exact form that it takes. Field work, which is also called participant observation, but sometimes non-participant observation can also be included in there. It's qualitative in focus because you're going out, you're observing, you're taking notes. That is textual data that cannot be quantified. Case studies, we just discussed about those, that level of detail. Once it can be mixed methods, but it almost always includes some qualitative aspect. So it is not a purely quantitative design in and of itself. Experimentation, which, like I said, that is going to be our primary focus for the rest of this chapter. Secondary analysis, usually this is when you use the data collected by another researcher for your own purposes. And so this is usually questionnaire data. It's normally quantitative. These are like the large scale surveys conducted by the government, so something like the census, or conducted by large research centers associated with universities. And then they make this data available to other researchers. In some cases, like the census, they make it available to the public. And then you can do your own analysis with the data that they collected. And so we call that secondary analysis. And this is actually the most common form of methodology used by sociologists. Oftentimes we're out there just doing secondhand data analysis on research that other people collected, because it is the least costly and the most time efficient. Content analysis is when you analyze material that was not created for the purpose of your study. It could be documents, it could be, forms of media. A friend of mine in graduate school did a content analysis of dating profiles. This is as to answer her question. For her thesis, because this was during the rise of online dating, before that was then replaced by dating apps. But yeah, so content analysis is kind of like a qualitative form of secondary analysis, in the sense that, except for the fact that in this case, you're using a spotter material that the originator of that material usually had no intentions or designs on it being used for research at all. Like, they created it for an entirely different reason. Unlike secondary analysis, which is data that was collected by researchers for their own intents and purposes, but is now being used by other researchers for their own purposes. And then finally, unobtrusive measures. This can be non-participant observation. This also can be ways of collecting data that people, you're going out in the field, but you are literally interacting with no people, or they're not even aware of your presence. So and a lot of textbooks kind of clump that together with field work. And that's why I said, depending on the textbook that was used to teach you, your introductory textbook, when you took Introduction to Sociology, you probably learned somewhere between 5 to 7 of these designs are the primary ones in sociology. What is interesting, and I guess is probably a hint that this textbook isn't necessarily focused solely on sociology majors, as opposed to just the broader, social science distinction, is the fact that, we do begin with this kind of focus on experimental versus non-experimental designs. And I'll discuss more about why that's an important observation to make, given our discipline of sociology, at the end of this chapter. But for right now, let's just jump back into the course material. So, experimental design is a study that includes an experiment and then analyzes the result, while quasi-experimental design conducts some form of intervention, testing, modification, or manipulation, and examines the results. And non-experimental design does not include any manipulation at all. And non-experimental designs can be referred to as pre-experimental if these studies are conducted before the researcher establishes the need for an experiment. But the expectation is that the researcher might, down the road, establish the need for an experiment. So we're going to talk a little bit more about all 3 of these design types and provide examples of each. So beginning with experimental experimentation, one of our primary design types. So the classic experimental design, you see that kind of in the little graphic right there, is you have a control group and experimental group. Your experimental group is the one that's going to be exposed to the stimuli, your IV, your cause, and your control group, subjects are not exposed to the stimuli. In the classic experimental design, participants are randomly assigned to either the experimental group or the control group. And they also, data from them is collected both before and after the experiment, pre-test and post-test. And then you come to some type of conclusion by measuring the difference between the groups after they have been exposed to the stimuli, the IV, and that difference between the groups is the DV, right? It's the extent to which, their response differs. So that's kind of the classic experimental design. Another type of experimental design, because apparently it has been established that sometimes the pretest can then introduce an element of bias into your experiment. And if you think about it, like, I guess, depending on the questions that you put on your pretest, it might make them more or less aware of, what the purpose of the experiment is. The term for it is priming, right? Your pretest might prime them to answer or respond in some type of way. So another type of experimental design is called a Solomon 4-group experimental design. And your book notes that the main purpose of this design is to eliminate the potential biases of the pretest. So now, instead of 2 groups, you have 4 groups, 2 experimental and 2 control. Of those, only one of the controls and only one of the experimental groups takes the pretest. And so what you're trying to figure out is, did the pretest, did it bias them in any way? And you compare them to the group that does not. So you compare, like, your experimental group that did not get the pretest with the experimental group that did get the pretest, and same thing for the control groups, to see, like, okay, did my pretest in fact bias seem to create any type of systematic bias in terms of these groups' responses. So, long story short, a more complicated form of your classical experiment, but meant to particularly address concerns about pretest biases. So that's your experimental designs. Now you get your quasi-experimental designs. And the main thing to keep in mind about the quasi-experimental designs, like, do not get overwhelmed about the different types. Just know that in some way, all of the quasi-experimental designs deviate from the classic experimental design, which, reminder, requires two groups, experimental and control, that were randomly assigned, and they receive a pretest and a post-test. So very quickly, let's just consider these quasi-experimental designs. There's the randomized one group post-test. Obviously, the main key here, or post-test only design. So there's only one randomly selected group in the study. They aren't given a pretest, but they are given a post-test to measure the results from the experiment. So your participants are randomly selected, in terms of their participation in your study, but there is not a control group in this study. So they all receive the they all are exposed to the stimuli, and nor are they given a pretest. They're only given a post-test. Then there is the randomized post-test only control group design. So now you do have both an experimental and a control group, and they're still randomly assigned. But once again, they're not given a pretest, a post-test only. And so this one is pretty much identical to the classical experimental design, except, there is no pretest. So I guess, that is a way to potentially eliminate pretest bias without doing the more complicated Solomon four-group experimental design. Then we have three types of quasi-experimental designs where one of their key deviations from the classic experiment design is the fact that they are now non-randomized. So instead of them being randomly placed into groups, they are non-randomly in groups. And so the first one is, you still have your two groups, but the groups aren't randomized and there's no pretest. Then there's the one where the non-random pretest post-test control group, it is pretty much just like the classic experiment because there is the pretest, but your groups were not randomly assigned. And then there is your non-random pretest post-test. There's only one group, and so, but your participants weren't randomly selected to be in your study. So, obviously, in a perfect world, you could randomly place people in different groups. And this is the type of experiment, the classic experiment that you see, especially like in pharmaceutical studies. But in the real world, in real settings, and this is particularly true of like a lot of educational research, which is why your book gave several examples related to education. You can't go around, randomly putting students in different groups, right? So like a good example would be if you are wanting to compare, the impact of going to an after school care program on, I don't know, social ability among elementary school kids. That's the type of thing where you're probably going to be relying on, what kids are already in the after school care and comparing them against the ones who aren't. And so that's going to be non-random, like they were selected already, they already existed in those groups. And so, that type of one, whether or not you did a pre-test, post-test, if you did not have any contact with them, before they enrolled in the after school care, and you only, had contact with them after, then, that example I just made up off the top of my head, is a good example of what we would consider to be a non-random post-test only control group. You have your two groups, your control group, those who are not in after school care, the experimental group, those who are in after school care. You didn't start collecting data from them until they were already in after school care or not, and this wasn't randomly done. This was the decision of their parents. So a lot of non-laboratory, real world, types of experimental designs. That's part of why they're quasi-experimental, is the fact that we can't necessarily go around randomly assigning people statuses and groups, in order to have a perfect experiment. And then finally, there are non-experimental designs. And your book kind of quickly talks about two, and that's because they're going to talk about these in much longer detail, in future chapters. So for right now, it's enough to just say that, non-random cross-sectional survey design. So, this is where you give out a survey. It's a one shot because it's cross-sectional, and the participants aren't randomly selected. So, everyone doesn't have the equal chance of being, part of your survey. Maybe it's a survey of convenience, or maybe you allow people to opt in, or, maybe you have people suggest people who will take your survey. So it's like a snowballing sample. Some of this will make more sense when we get to the sampling chapter. The other type of non-experimental design that they briefly address is the longitudinal cohort study. And we've already kind of talked about, what those cohort studies and panel studies and trend studies look like. So those are your non-experimental designs. Now, I said it's very interesting that, this is kind of where we start, because it's worth noting that sociology, we do a lot of non-experimental research. We don't use experiments nearly as much as psychology. And to the extent that we do any type of experimental research, a lot of it is quasi-experimental. Like, there isn't a lot of classic experimental research design that happens in sociology, compared to psychology. Why is that? Well, that's because experiments are, they tend to have small samples, which brings up issues of generalizability. Those samples are oftentimes non-representative, which for sociologists is because of what we study versus what psychologists study. This tends to be a bigger deal to us. A lot of experiments that are taking place, especially like in lab settings, it is not, they tend to be younger, they are more likely to be white, they're more likely to be educated, in psychology studies in particular, because it's usually psychology undergraduates that are taking place in these studies. And so these aren't very representative samples. And so once again, that's problematic for sociologists, because of that lack of generalizability. And then, especially for true classic experiments, experimental design, where it's in that lab setting, and the intervention and the random assignment to the control or the experimental group, these conditions are contrived. These are not real world settings, and they aren't meant to mimic real world settings. And oftentimes, because sociology is a little bit more interested in how things play out in the real world, versus psychology, of course, which is a little bit more interested in human behavior and cognitions and things that are happening inside people's heads, more so than what is happening around them. Sociologists do not use this design nearly as much. That being said, Experiments can be informative, and have been several that are significant. And just because sociologists don't conduct them, it doesn't prevent us from, doing things like citing them and teaching them to our students and drawing important conclusions from them. And so just three that I strongly encourage you, if you haven't discussed or learned about before, just three that frequently come up in lower level sociology classes are, Robber's Cave, which is meant to emphasize, helping behavior, and the Stanford Prison Experiment, which was used to draw some conclusions about authority, and how authority and positions of dominance influence people's behavior. And Milgram experiment, which was an important experiment used to draw conclusions about obedience and authority. We let psychologists do a lot of the experiments, especially pure, classical experiments, and not the quasi-experiments. But sometimes when they come to these interesting conclusions and observations, we definitely then kind of fold them into our knowledge base, our literature. Even if often for sociologists, it's the non-experimental designs that we focus on. And so that will be the focus of our upcoming chapters.